Okay guys, so what I want to do in this video is take you through the seated cable row, not just a basic tutorial, but to kind of explain some of the variations that are available to you deliberately, but also some of the variations that you might see performed in the gym, which potentially might be undesirable in some cases, depending on what you're trying to train. So there are compensations that can be made here to make the exercise a lot easier without necessarily making it more productive for your training goal. Okay, so taking it back to kind of our basic, exercise mechanics and anatomy content, what we're always thinking about here when it comes to what we're training is we're thinking about the relationship between the cables and our body when we're doing cable exercises. So the cable in general is going to be the line of force that we're dealing with, and that's going to tell us where the challenge is likely to be. So if Paddy does a basic seated row for me there, he's going to be placing the feet up in front. That's your point of stability. That's always what you want in an exercise like this. He's sitting upright. So what I'm concerned with here now is the relationship between this cable and his shoulder joint. So if we're training the shoulder extensors, that's what we're thinking about. So as he pauses there, he's got the line of force here running roughly in line with the forearm. So this is the moment arm that's creating a shoulder flexion challenge here. So you can tell that his shoulder extensors, his lats, his teres major, etc., are going to be working really hard there, okay? As he comes back out into the stretch position, especially if he leans forward a little, you can see that line of force is coming back here almost in line with the shoulder. It's still a little bit below it, but there's going to be far less of a challenge on the lats when you're here. So that's why it's hardest when you pull it towards you. Now, there are different ways that this can be adjusted. So if he's leaning forward loads like this and performing the exercise fixed like that, we can see that that line of force now is more similar to a pull down. So it's going to be a little bit closer to that shoulder joint as he brings it towards him, because now it's running through here and the shoulder joint is tilted forward and slightly closer. So it's not going to be quite as hard as it was if he was bringing the arms all the way back, but what we have to realize is that he's also dealing with a different point in the range of motion. So his shoulder is not going to be extending quite as much, so the lats aren't going to be getting quite as short, and they'll have a greater potential to produce force. So you can rest it down there for a second. So what I want you to think about there is that, right, I introduced the concept of the line of force itself, the relationship between that and the shoulder. So if we look purely at that, we can say that as he leans forward, it should technically be getting a little bit easier because the line of force is getting closer to the axis as he leans forward. But we also have to think about, okay, what's going on there in terms of the actual mechanics of the lats themselves. So we're also getting into a position when we lean forward that those lats are going to have a little bit more potential to produce force when they're up in this position rather than when the shoulder is back in that position. So in general, you'll find that that's actually quite a nice variation with that leaned forward variation. So that's something you might want to play around with. Again, I'm not trying to look at these things from the perspective of good or bad, just trying to get you to identify some of the differences. So in summary, when you're sitting up higher, it's generally going to provide a really strong shortened range challenge to the lats where they're a little bit weaker. Whereas when you're leaning forward a little bit more, the challenge is going to be greatest where the lats are stronger, and in general there's going to be less of a difference between the starting point and the end point versus the fully seated or fully upright version. Along with that, you've got other variations that are accessible too. So what you'll see some people do is lean back quite a bit as they perform the row. So Paddy's going to demonstrate that now. So as you lean back there, it looks like you're working through a really, really large range of motion, but when you actually start to break it down, the amount that the shoulder is moving isn't actually that large technically. So as he brings the cable to there, his shoulder is extending quite a bit, but he's used his body to bring that cable quite far. And because as he leans forward there and keeps the shoulder in the same position, you can see that's the same as him pulling just as far as there. So there's actually more he can go there as he pulls. If you stay in that position, there's more range of motion there that you can make up for by very simply just leaning back. And that's just because of the relationship there between your stomach or your abdomen and the cable. So what you want to do if you're trying to just keep it real strict with the range of motion is keep that upright position and be honest about where the cable is getting to. It doesn't mean you have to pull it to your stomach, but don't fool yourself by just leaning back and making up the distance there by just leaning back and stealing basically 4 to 6 inches of the range of motion. Now, with that said, is this a fine variation to do where you're leaning forward and leaning back? Absolutely, because one of the things we didn't mention that I want to bring into the conversation now is that when you do lean forward a lot and you start to reach forward like that, his starting point is now from above 90 degrees more or less of shoulder flexion, whereas when he's back here, he's actually, if he treats that as his starting point, you'll see he only has a very small, maybe 45 degrees of shoulder flexion to work through. So it's a smaller range of motion, whereas when he leans forward, he's working more of that range of motion to a higher degree of shoulder flexion. So there's always trade-offs here, guys, and that's what you have to think about, is there's trade-offs in terms of where the challenge is greatest, what range of motion you're working, and again, it's not a case of good versus bad or what's the perfect way, because there's different things going on. So if we come back into that leaned back position again and you row in, what you have to realize here is that now that this line of force is going back this way through the body, what it's also trying to do is pull the shoulder blades down. So because it's pulling that way, it's the same as him doing a type of a shrugging motion. So now there's a challenge against the upper traps, more so than there would be if he was sitting upright. So you're going to find that the upper traps are working a bit more, whereas the middle to lower traps might be working a bit more when you're sitting upright. So again, that's something to consider. Along with that, when he does lean back, there's going to be less of a challenge on the lats there, because the line of force as it cuts through there is much closer to the shoulder as he brings it down closer to the floor. And obviously the extreme is if he lies down fully, now it's basically just a shrug. So there's basically a spectrum here from far more lat dominant exercise when you're here to far more upper trap dominant exercise when you're down there. So you can rest the weight down again, Paddy. So remember, guys, it's trade-offs and it's slight changes in what is working and what is working at different points in the range of motion. So when you're trying to analyze this exercise and see what your client is doing or what you think they should do, you're not just thinking muscles working, you're also thinking of range of motion available. What range of motion are we trying to work? Does it matter? For many, it just won't. For many, it's just a case of, okay, you know, they're trying to build a bit of back muscle in general. Let's just get them training, see what's comfortable, fine, leave it at that, you know, boom, done, very simple. Whereas if you have a client that's saying, Gary, I'm doing these seated rows for years. I never feel my lats working. I've got this big upper back that has developed. My traps are real developed. My shoulders are developed, but my lats they never really feel stimulated. And you see they're leaning back there like Paddy was, then that might give you an answer or a clue as to why that might be the case. And if you see that featured in other rowing exercises, so for example, if they're doing their barbell rows and they're doing a similar thing, they're leaning up and they're basically turning it into a shrugging exercise, that can start to give you some answers. So this is why understanding basic anatomy that's involved and the exercise mechanics in terms of the relationship between the line of force you're dealing with and the joint of interest, when you start to understand those things and you start to understand the different ranges of motion that you're working in when you change the body position, it can start to explain these things. And that's ultimately what we want as trainers. We want explanations, if not just for the case of understanding what we're prescribing, also because we want to actually be specific with our prescription. So we want to be able to say, I can give this to this client because they have this goal, and this client because they have this goal. And you also want to be able to troubleshoot. If you have that client who says, I never feel my lats working, my lats are very underdeveloped, what can I do? That you can look at their exercise, you can break it down from first principles, and now you know how to prescribe exercise more objectively. Similarly, it might be the case that you have someone who has some sort of injury, and they always find that their seated rows are provocative for whatever reason, and you see that, oh, you're going into a range of motion that you maybe can't tolerate at this point in time, but we can adjust the range of motion, we can adjust the point at which the resistance is greatest, and then maybe you can get a little bit more out of the exercise. So one final thing that I want to touch on is basically like that upright seated row variation is what we'll kind of be prescribing and advising most of the time. It's very easy to standardize, and for that reason we like to kind of use it. But one of the things that I did say there was that because if you do another rep for me and just pause at the stomach, the line of force is so far from the joint axis when you get to here, that means that the challenge is greatest at this point. So that's going to be the limiting factor. Whereas if Paddy comes way out here, like he might have 20 reps worth of strength for the first half of the rep, but only 12 reps of strength for the end of the rep. So if we're in a personal training context and I want my client to get as much as they can out of the 1 or 2 sets that we might be doing, then as they pull in, I'm going to let them do that and then give them a bit of assistance into the end of the range of motion. So no assistance there, assistance there. No assistance there, a little bit of assistance there. And as the set goes on and they begin to fatigue, I'm going to be providing more and more assistance as they struggle in that shortened position. So what I'm doing is I'm using the art of spotting to be able to customize the resistance where it's greatest, where it's least, to be able to basically allow that individual to get the most out of the exercise that we're doing. Because what you don't want is for everything to be going just fine and then the shortened range to just get fatigued and you can't finish the set, even though you have so much left to give for 75% of the range of motion. So that's why understanding this stuff can be really helpful for exercise prescription. So give that stuff a go, guys. Check it out with different clients, you know, see what's working for different people, try to troubleshoot some of the complaints that they might be having, and it will definitely make you a better trainer that can apply exercise across a broader range of individuals.